The decade or so of the peace policy was also, ironically, one of the great eras of military activity in Indian country in American history. And it's probably the era most associated in the popular mind with warfare against the tribes. It's the post-Civil War decade and a half that gave us the Battle of Little Bighorn and Geronimo, the Fort Marion prisoners, etc. And when many people think about Indians and think about movies about Indians, often they're imagining in their minds the scenes of those days in the 1870s and 1880s when the U.S. cavalry was out on the northern and southern plains fighting against organized bands of tribes. This is John Ford's era, John Wayne's era, etc. But I want to sort of give you a little bit of information about that. We're going to talk about it, but also place it in the context of the federal policy of the time, which, remember, was the peace policy. The goal of the peace policy was to introduce Christianity effectively into Indian country through the presence of agents who were representatives of organized churches, school teachers who were representatives of organized churches, etc. And eventually, the goal was to convert individual tribal citizens into individual Christian / primarily Protestant American citizens, participants in the political structure, participants in the economy, and participants in the social community. But sometimes the tribal members would stray, the policy contemplated, and so the army was to be brought in to provide discipline. This is what happened in the Dakotas in the northern plains in the mid-1870s. When the tribes had agreed to treaty terms under which the Great Sioux Reservation had been established, then subsequently reduced in size, a group of Sioux tribal members, of Lakota tribal members, happened to be hunting off reservation and traditional lands, were ordered back to the reservation, couldn't make it in time, and so they were declared hostiles, which is to say persons operating outside of the expectations of the treaty. And the peace policy called, under those circumstances, for the military to step in and enforce the treaty obligations as the United States understood them, to provide a little severity, a little discipline to the wayward Indian ward, to get them back on the correct path, or at least this is what the policy contemplated. And so the war erupts on the northern plains. The 7th Cavalry annihilated at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but eventually the U.S. succeeds in those wars, and the Black Hills are acquired by the United States. It turns out to be a great source of gold, and also a great source of problem in litigation, but that's a story for the 20th century, problem for the United States. But it's not just the upper plains where military actions occurring. Colorado, there are Indian wars in Arizona, in New Mexico. These are the various Apache groups, some under the control of the leader we know as Geronimo, and the various tribes of western Oklahoma, many of whom have come there as a consequence of removal treaties incident to military actions precipitated or that occurred during this period. In fact, the whole of the period of the peace policy was so marked by military action, by the use of severity to enforce the civilizing process, if you will, that a lot of folks thought it was time to move the Indian Office back to the War Department. It had been moved from War to Interior in the early 19th century, and now a number of folks advocated it looked like it was time to move it back. But that never happened because the wars eventually finished in the 1880s for the most part, so much so that in 1883, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was in charge of the army in the West, in the Midwest, could write, "I now regard the Indians as substantially eliminated from the problem of the army." It wasn't just the army that had done this, although it was primarily the army that had done this. The railroad played a major role, and in part that was a military role. 1869, the first transcontinental line is created, then a number of spur lines, which made it much easier for troops to move from one location to another as needed to, again, apply severity where needed to enforce treaty obligations from the vantage of the U.S., that being what was called for. And the largely successful slaughter of the bison or buffalo, which occurred during this period. Millions of buffalo reduced to a relative handful. The social impact of this on the Plains tribes was enormous. A lot of reformers thought it was a great thing because now Plains tribal members had to become farmers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have anything to eat. The great days of hunting were gone. And it may well be that that's true. General Sherman seemed to believe that the slaughter of the buffalo played a major role in the process of civilizing the tribes, despite the ecological damage that it did, as well as the cultural damage that it did. Now, it's not fair to say that the only action was military, the only action in resistance, in tribal resistance to the federal policy that was being implemented was military. There was a softer form of resistance going on as well, and in the long term that may have had a greater impact, although that's a bit hard to assess. And I want to focus on one story to illustrate that, and we'll finish with this story. It's the story of the Poncas and Chief Standing Bear. The Poncas had been removed to the Indian Territory from the Upper Plains in 1877 and settled on the Quapaw Reservation. This was in January 1879, and it was wintertime. There was much hardship, death, and disease. It was the Poncas' own Trail of Tears, the move south. By the early spring, some of the Poncas had said, we don't like living here. We're going home. And a group led by Standing Bear started moving north. By the early spring, they were in Nebraska and decided to settle for a while with the Omaha Nation. The city of Omaha is nearby, and a number of the non-Indian citizens of the city of Omaha took note of the plight of these Poncas, these people removing, trying to get back home again. You can imagine this is a religious era. Some folks are thinking about the Israelites trying to go home from Egypt, and decided to make Standing Bear's and the Poncas' cause their own. When the army showed up, as happened, this is the peace policy, to collect these Poncas, these wayward Poncas, and put them back in the Indian Territory, a group of citizens of Omaha, led by or inspired or encouraged by General George Crook, an Army officer, took up their case and filed an application for writ of habeas corpus with the local federal court. Habeas corpus is a writ in which the court directs whoever's holding a person allegedly unlawfully to let him go. You have the body of habeas corpus, bring them here, and if they're being held unlawfully, then I'm going to make you let them go. And that's in fact what happened here. Standing Bear's case was called on April 30th. Judge Elmer Dundee of the U.S. District Court in Omaha, in Nebraska, said, yeah, Standing Bear is eligible for habeas relief. Habeas relief is available to all persons under U.S. law, and an Indian, despite the fact that he's not a U.S. citizen, is a person under U.S. law. And consequently, I see that you have no grounds to hold him, and you have to let him go. Now, when we look back on the Standing Bear case, the storyline, the story that we remember is this declaration that an Indian is a person as an acknowledgement in U.S. law. And that's important, although at the time, I think this wasn't what was seen as important. That was an interpretation of federal habeas statutory provisions and an application to Standing Bear. What happened contemporaneously to Standing Bear was that he became a bit of a celebrity, as did the Poncas, and ended up, in mind, we're at the end of the peace policy era. The churches are going to pull out in 1882 from the administration of federal Indian policy. We're in 1879, almost 1880 at this point. But Standing Bear's story is going to spread east through public lectures, etc., and influence a whole new generation of reformers. Many of them, most of them, not affiliated with churches. Some of them New England intellectuals who will become writers. Helen Hunt Jackson, who will be inspired to write A Century of Dishonor, castigating the United States for failed Indian policies, etc. And this new group of reformers, inspired by the plights, these sort of soft resistance plights of people like Chief Standing Bear of the Poncas, will inaugurate our next phase of federal Indian policy. That'll be the topic of our next class.